It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
All right. Welcome back, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'll be your host here this morning. And we have a special guest we want to bring back onto our program. Jack Spirko from TheSurvivalPodcast was gracious enough to have me on his program a few months back. And Jack has some groundbreaking discussions that we're going to have in reference to some financial issues. As many of you know, we've talked pretty routinely about some of the crises that are going on in our financial sector and how the government is looking to essentially utilize your revenue and your money to incorporate and enhance its own positioning. Jack has been gracious enough to agree to come on to our program and talk to us about that. Good morning, Jack.
Michael.
I'm sorry. Good morning, Jack. I apologize. I hit the wrong button.
Well, that's all right. Thanks for having me on, Michael. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for the opportunity for our listenership to hear from you. So, you know, you and I had talked previously when I was on your program, and you'd kind of given me an overview of some of the things that were happening with issues surrounding private pension funds, and now we've recently heard from the president during the State of the Union issue about his issue or his idea with this My IRA or My Ray, and so I think that plays into this a little bit. But you know, part of the issue is that we're looking here at debt levels that are, for all intents and purposes, incomprehensibly huge. Just so that people recognize it, I posted an article up the other day that the global asset wealth of the wealthiest people in the world is only in the $20 trillion range. Just so that they would recognize exactly how much $17 trillion really is. In other words, if we stole all of their collected wealth, we would barely be able to pay off our own debt. And that's only the debt. That's not the unfunded debt. That's just ours, and it's just the amount that's on the books. So,
and of course, all of those people are not Americans, and all of these other nations have debt as well. So
exactly,
there's more debt than there is money is the way that it really works out.
Right. And if we count in our debt that no one is attributing to the 17 trillion, or in other words, the other 250 trillion of other mandates that we have, I mean, we couldn't sell the planet to the Martians for that kind of revenue. So, it's kind of frightening. So you had kind of indicated to me that there were billions of dollars that American citizens have that are in private pension funds and 401ks and retirement programs through corporations and things like that. And a lot of that has already been forced into government debt without anyone's knowledge. And that is a frightening aspect that I don't think a lot of people realize. So if you don't mind, maybe you can kind of give us an idea of, first of all, how that's done, why it was done, and who's subjected to it, or who's already a part of it.
Well, let's start out with how I figured it out. Before I was a crazy renegade survival podcaster, I was a respectable guy that ran multiple companies in typical corporate America. And as an owner or partner in these companies, I always wanted to make sure that my employees had access to a decent retirement account along with other benefits. One, so I could attract good people, but two, it doesn't really cost you much to provide your employees an option to save their own money. So we were happy to do that.
Sure.
And every time I talked to a plan administrator, I always said, I want to make sure that my employees have a fund within their 401k account that they can move their money into cash within the account anytime they want to. And they always said, we have to do that. Being naive, I thought that meant there was a law. And apparently what it actually meant is, at the time anyway, it was just a policy of large plan administrators like, American Express or Edward Jones, that would be the case. So in 2008, I started doing my podcast, and I really saw the financial crisis coming. And I started telling people, get your money out of the stock market. And I got email after email after email from people saying, well, I don't want to liquidate my 401k. And I'd say, well, just put your money in cash in your 401k. And people got that. Over the years, I've said, there's times when there's market corrections coming and to do these same things. I started getting more and more emails from people telling me, well, Jack, I can't put my money into a cash value account in my 401k anymore because there isn't one anymore. The safe option is now a U.S. government bond fund. And my initial response was BS. There's no way they have to do it. And then they'd send me their plan outline, and I'd go, well, I hate doing it, but move to the bond fund if you need to, get out of the way of a correction.
Right.
And then I said to my audience, like, this is new to me, and I'd been out of the corporate mainstream for a while now. So I started saying, I want everybody out there that has a 401k plan to report back to me and just let me know, do you or do you not have a money market style, cash style account now in your 401k? And the numbers that came back shocked me. I would say 9 out of 10 told me no. So what happened was a very quiet removal of the option to keep your money inside your 401k in cash. And of course, what it was replaced with was U.S. government bond funds and municipal bond funds. So by doing that with a policy change, and trust me, there's no way that people inside these corporations did this without a handshake from government. Americans just had that safe portion, that 20 or 30% that you put into that safe portion,
right,
just moved over to debt. Nobody told them about it. Nobody talked about it. I've never heard anybody in the mainstream discuss this. And now I'm hearing from people saying that they're being automatically enrolled in 401ks and they have to go down to HR and opt out. If they don't go out and go down to HR and opt out, all the money that goes into, guess what? The bond funds. And a lot of these companies are doing this. Like, they'll enroll you as a new employee at 1%, just because you should save something. Well, the second year goes to 2%. The third year goes to 3%, and it goes all the way up to 5%. And they're doing this without your consent. And to protect you, they're moving you into this government bond fund and then saying, here's your plan. You can put your money wherever you want. Well, the average workaday American that's just trying to make a living thinks, oh, it's 1%. And they just go on and figure, well, it must be good. And between those two maneuvers, we have just, countless dollars every day now flowing into U.S. treasuries, which has taken the pressure off of the need for us to sell treasuries abroad or to buy our own debt with things like quantitative easing. And it's kind of shocking to think about the fact that this has been done. And again, I have not yet spoken to anybody that's ever heard about it in mainstream media at all.
So let me just make sure I understand this. What you're indicating here is that these pension funds, which would be would be contributory by the employee, i.e. a 401k as an example,
correct,
that these pension funds are not self-directed, but they are automatically being invested in government treasuries with or without your consent and knowledge.
That's a smaller part of it. That's the recent development. But the self-directed 401ks, we're not talking about IRAs here. We're talking about 401ks where you're very limited in the funds that you can invest in.
Right.
As long as I can remember, going back to the 80s, if you had a 401k, there was a cash value fund in there that you could choose.
Right.
And these funds have been just slowly weeded out, picked out to where that's just not the option anymore. And what has happened is in most of these situations, if you had money there, then they grandfathered that for you and that money could stay there. If you pull it out, it's gone. It's like it evaporates. Any money that you had allocated to a fund like that now goes into these government bond funds. And every new employee that signs up, when their financial liar walks in that administrates the plan and says, put 10% or 20% into this conservative safe place. That's conservative safe place used to be, a 1%, 1.5% money market fund. Now it's a government bond fund. So it's multiple ways that the money's been maneuvered into that vehicle. And it's simply that even though you can still choose where you put it, the option to put it in cash is gone. So most people want some portion safe, and now that safety is Uncle Sam's bonds.
Amazing. And you're absolutely correct that dramatically, when you're talking about the 100 million Americans that are involved in the process here, that dramatically reduces the need for the Federal Reserve to be able to essentially monetize our debt backward, right? Or
correct,
for us to be forced to sell to China or Japan or any of the other major debt holders. So
yeah, because what I think most people don't get, it's not the size of the debt that matters. It's can we service our debt? As long as you can pay the MasterCard people, the Visa people keep giving you money. And as long as you can pay the Visa people, the MasterCard people keep giving you money. Now, our government doesn't have to do that because they can turn the printing presses on. But they can only do that so frequently and so often before they get into a situation where people aren't willing to buy the debt. Now, if they can create the illusion that they're selling a few billion here and a few billion there and a few billion here in debt, then all of a sudden it actually restores quite a bit of confidence in the foreign markets, and you're actually able to do a little bit better selling debt. And the other thing that's kind of bailed us out is, as crappy as it is, there's not a better place to park large amounts of money right now in a immediately liquidatable form than the dollar. So if you're a foreign nation and you're going to park some of your reserves in dollars, you're going to do it with bond debt. So these things together have worked to kind of keep the ship sailing on the horizon, so to speak, without having the bottom pull out. And that's where a lot of people are going, I don't get it. Now it's 17 trillion. It's going to be 22 trillion by the next presidential election. How does this work? Well, as long as you can keep the cycle turning over, you can get away with it.
Right, right. You know, the other side of this, though, is that at the same point in time, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has grown exponentially. So how does that account or tie back into this? Because if they're growing exponentially and they're drawing this revenue stream out of, I mean, now it's almost like they're double dipping.
Well, of course they are. And I mean, it really doesn't change anything on the Fed Reserve side of the thing. They've had to do as much as they've had to do, even with this change. And this change is not enough, right? Because most
now
Americans
that's really
are only
scary.
Again, putting 10%, 20% into that safe haven within those 401ks. And there's only so much money there.
Right.
So they're having to look to expand beyond this. This was a first step. And it was like, you've got a gaping wound and they put a Band-Aid on one end of it. And, you know, my IRA is a Band-Aid on the other end of it. And eventually what they're trying to do is seal this wound. And I don't know that they can, but they can certainly buy themselves time by making moves like this. And again, most people have just no clue this has been done. And it's not like they took your money away from you. They changed your options. And for all intents and purposes, if you're holding U.S. bonds, you're holding cash.
Right.
The day a U.S. bond is worthless, so's a dollar.
Right. Right.
But the fact that it was necessary for them to do it tells you something about how precarious the situation that we're in is.
Well, so let me ask you something, because the IMF has been talking openly now, and not just about in the United States, but globally, about the option for governments to go in and seize capital, and starting with retirement accounts, but not limited to that, and utilize that to pay off banking debt and to pay off government debt. So how does that relate to all of this? In other words, if they've already got the Fed monetizing and they've got these contributions from pensions, private pensions, and they're going to talk now about having the IMF go in and basically pull another Cyprus type, skimming off the top. I mean, how much do they need, and what are the implications of that for the fact that you're already holding this debt, which is then going to be even further watered down?
Well, I mean, the answer to how much they need is more than there is, right? So this is at this point, this is not
right.
Let's fix it. It's let's kick the can a little further until we figure out how we're going to handle this. I mean, cutting to the upshoot, I think that at some point that the plan is and always has been a dollar revaluation, that they'll actually revalue the dollar, whether they go back to a gold standard and all the gold bugs think it's great for like 5 minutes until they see how it actually works, or they just come up with a new commodity-backed currency, or they just do a basically what would amount to a reverse stock split on the dollar with a large inflation spike at one time. But at some point, things going the way they are, the only option is to hit a reset button. The key is they can't do it right now. They're too interladen themselves with the ship, so to speak. So they say when the rats start jumping off the ship, you're really in trouble. It's really going down, and our rats are just now starting to jump off the ship, and it takes them a while to get away from it. I mean, you can look at things like, so a couple of years ago, a Chinese corporation bought Smithfield Pork.
Right.
And you say, well, what does that have to do with this? Well, hold on. Here's how it all ties together. So when you actually look at that, what you find out is that it was a Chinese shell corporation. And it was run by the son of a former Chinese prime minister. Actually ran this company and several other small shell corporations. And if you go to their websites, they look like something a 14-year-old did in Front Page in 2002. I mean, that's how shell these things are.
Right.
And then the Congress looked at this and said, is it really okay to let China control the largest pork producer in America? And the reason they gave for the fact that it was okay is it wasn't really China. It was all funded by Goldman Sachs through the Chinese Shell Corporation.
Hello.
So to me, all that is that quite a few bigwigs in Goldman Sachs just bought themselves either Chinese or Singapore or Malaysian passports,
right,
with your money, by the way. And they're what the financial elite are doing right now is they're beginning to set up shop outside of the country, but yet they're not going to go away and leave us alone. They're going to leave us with the bill, but they still want to control the restaurant. So they're making moves like that so they can actually control United States corporations from abroad. And they can't afford to have the economy collapse the way that it eventually has to until they've got enough of that set up. Because even when it collapses, you know how people like this are. They don't lose because an economy collapses. They win because an economy collapses.
Right.
So I think they're trying to stave that off as long as they can to get their pieces in place on the chessboard. I know that may sound a little conspiratorial, but when you actually look at the facts and you look at the facts that things like that have occurred, and you look at the facts that Americans have had their retirements pushed into debt, and now we have the MyRA thing, which is just the first step in going toward mandatory retirement accounts. You get into a place where you realize all they're trying to do is pump this debt up for as long as possible. And the truth is, eventually, they can't do it forever. We all know that. If we know that, so do they.
Sure. You know, and they've actually set the stage for mandatory IRA. And you know how they've done it? The mandate of Obamacare.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
if they can force you into commerce to buy insurance, they can also force you into commerce to obtain a retirement account, like it or not, even when you're not employed in a corporation, as an example.
Well, here's what they're going to do. So they released this MyRA thing, and it's for low-income people, which is kind of pointless because they don't have much money to save. What they'll do is they'll go to a mandatory enrollment for this for anybody that's making, I don't know, $50,000 or less and doesn't have a 401k, but it's not mandatory because the employee can go down to HR and opt out, just like they've done with 401ks. And most people will go, well, it's $5 a week or $25 a week or whatever, and they'll go, well, I need something saved for my retirement. Now, right now, the MyRAs say, well, once you get, I think it's to $15,000, or if you've held it for more than 30 years, it has to be rolled into an individual retirement account.
Right.
They'll never enforce that.
Of course.
They could care less if you leave the money there until you die.
Right. And if it's all going into government bonds, it's even better.
Yeah, debt is as good as money to them. They'll take it with a tax. They'll take it with a loan. They don't care how they'll take it with inflation.
Right.
So that's just the beginning, though. What they're going to do is they're going to use our old friend class warfare, and they'll start making this thing look like it's a really good thing for poor people. And then, middle class America will say, well, why can't we have it too? And someone along the line will say, well, Americans aren't saving enough for their retirement even with this program. And they'll say, well, the greedy employers could give up 2% for this. I mean, it's not that big of a burden. And what they'll do is they'll create Social Security 2.0 with it. And you'll have a program that's basically a mandated employer-provided pension backed by U.S. government debt.
Right.
And then we can really kick the can down the road, can't we?
Right. Amazing.
And this sounds ridiculous, but, I've been saying this now for 4 years, and you're just seeing the pieces come one at a time, one after the other. And it really what tipped me off again was back in about 2010 when people started telling me there's no more cash value funds in my retirement. And I'll bet most of your listeners don't realize this. And I bet if most of them go look at their 401k plans at work, whether they're enrolled or not, you can get from your HR department, the plan and say, well, I want to know what it is. I bet you'll find that 9 out of 10 of them will come back to you and they'll tell you there is no cash option anymore.
Right. Years ago when I worked for a large corporation, I had a pension, and when they went bankrupt, it was Nortel Networks. They merged everything into a quasi-public-private public benefit guarantee fund, which they will not allow you to take the money out from. You cannot migrate it into and merge it with a standard IRA. You have to leave it with them. And they are a government agency. And essentially, that's the deal. They basically hold on to your money, and then they guarantee that they'll give you some stipend down the road when I'm too old to really care or want it. So you're absolutely correct, and they've already been moving, and that's another one of these pieces that you were talking about falling into place. Now this,
yeah, and there's more than that. I mean, just what you said there kind of brings up something I forgot. So it used to be not that long ago, if you needed money and you're like, I don't want to borrow money for myself, I just want to liquidate my 401k and I'll take the penalty and take the hit.
Right.
That you could do that. Most companies now you can't do that. You can't get your money out of your 401k come hell or high water unless you quit your job or you're terminated.
Right.
So that's another way of holding the money hostage, because understand that they don't want all the money that's in 401ks to go into government debt, because they need some of it in the stock market,
sure.
Right? But they do want it captive in the marketplace.
Right. You know, the problem, of course, with all of this is that at some point in time, they're going to start to skim these retirement accounts, whether they do it as 401ks or whether they, irrespective of how they do it. And they're going to skim both the government and the 401 or the market funds, I would imagine. So
it's very possible they'll do a wealth tax.
And
they'll say that we have to do this to save the country and you're un-American if you don't support it. And they'll just say that we need 5% of what everybody has in their retirement accounts. And it's either that or the whole thing, you know, goes south and you don't get anything. So we're going to save the country with this. That's one way they may do it.
Right. Now, here's the real question. How did they manage to pull this off without anybody knowing about it, any laws being passed, no congressional hearings, no bankers talking about it? How are they keeping this under wraps?
Well, I think that the truth is that nobody seems to care, and getting, you know, the financial institutions to do something this simple, which is simply change the plan portfolio when you've been doling them out billions and billions of dollars in bailouts, isn't a real hard thing to get done. I mean, you know, if you're Bank of America, if you're Chase or what have you, or even if you're a plan administrator like Edward Jones, and your whole livelihood has been spared because, well, you know, Uncle Sam has come in with trillions of dollars in the bailouts, and we kind of need you to, you know, make this little change for us. And it was probably not that direct. It was probably far more, you know, it's just better for people because interest rates are low now because we've destroyed them, and they can't make any money on these things. At least the government bonds pay them a couple points. So it would just be better for people if we just looked after them by taking away an option from them. Because remember, it's not like, well, they took away the cash option and gave you the bond option.
Right.
There was always bond. I mean, I never saw a 401k plan without a U.S. government bond option and a decent municipal bond option.
Right.
Both of them were always there. They just removed one. They just plucked it out. So it's real easy to do something like that because it doesn't require a law. It's just a policy change.
Sure.
And it doesn't require somebody in the Federal Reserve, or it doesn't require someone in the Department of Treasury to do anything. It just requires that the people that are playing ball already keep playing ball.
And the truth is, most people don't even realize it because no one mentions it because they're thinking, well, that's only my plan. And nobody
Correct.
in Company A and Company B are comparing notes and saying, oh, really? It's gone out of your plan too?
Yeah, no. And the other thing is that it's not something people think about a lot.
Right.
When people look at their 401k, did the balance go up?
Right.
I mean, that's what they look at. So they don't really think about it. So what I think I found was that my listeners in themselves did not notice it until I was saying, look, you need to pay attention. You can't leave this stuff on autopilot. They say, you know, don't trade, hold the long term. I'm like, that's loser language. When you see a major correction coming, and most major corrections, I'm not talking 2% tomorrow. I'm talking big major corrections are telegraphed. You know they're coming. Log into your account, move it into a safe haven, and wait. And when they went to do that, or at least say, well, when this is coming, I want to be able to do that, and they investigated it, they're like, Jack, you're crazy. There's no cash option in here. And then you got awareness out of it. But until that point, even the people that, because the company didn't announce this, they didn't send you a memo.
Right.
You know, it just occurred, and it's in one of those giant prospectuses And we all know what we do with those. They make
Sure.
great fire starters, right?
Exactly. And not to mention the fact that out of that 400 pages, it's on page 362, and it's one paragraph. And
Correct.
Yeah, there's just, I get it. Now, let me ask you something about, and I don't, if this drags us off track, stop me, but do you feel or see this tied in any way, shape, or form to the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is a kind of a cross, it's almost an economic merger with the EU?
I am not up to speed enough on that entire thing.
Okay.
To really tell you, but what it sounds like is an international commerce agreement and financial management agreement between two economies. And if that's the case, then it would make sense to me. But I'm totally spitballing here when I say this, that you might say to a company that you're going to buy in a merger, for instance, hey, we're all for this merger, but you got this debt problem. You need to do something to shore that up a little bit before we go forward. And even the other side of the merger, if you also have a debt problem, might say this. Yeah, we'll both square that away a little bit, and then we can move together with this merger. So I don't think it's like the New World Order conspiracy that we'll all be paying homage to Merkel tomorrow or something like that. But there is a move toward globalization, and it would make sense that if you're going to put that type of a system in place, that you have to kind of make it look like a voluntary association. You can't make it look like both sides are totally hosed over and running to each other for safety, which in some ways is what they're doing. They think they can, save one bankrupt company by merging it with another one.
Right. So, all right, let me since we don't want to delve into that TTIP issue, let me just drag this back to quantitative easing for a moment.
Sure.
When we talk about quantitative easing, we now know, and the pressure is on, at least publicly, for the Fed to back off and begin to ease the amount of money.
Ease the easing, right?
Ease the easing. I was trying not to say that, but I guess there's no other way to say it. So the bank or the Federal Reserve wants to ease the easing, and there's a lot of public pressure to do so. So are you envisioning this almost as one scale sliding down while the other scale slides up to replace it, kind of thing?
Well, think about it this way. So what is quantitative easing? And the simplest definition I can give you is when the Federal Reserve takes the bank's debt, makes it their own, and replaces it with money. So they give the banks money for debt. And then the Federal Reserve holds the debt and either does or doesn't collect on it, depending on whether the debt actually pays itself off or not, or it could be offloaded and sold back to the banking institutions later.
Right.
And that's the basics of quantitative easing. So then you have to ask yourself, well, what do the banks do with the money? And I think most people think, well, banks take money and they loan it to you to buy a house. And banks don't loan you money to buy a house. They use the money they're holding in reserve to create new money, using you to create that money and creating a debt with you.
Right.
So when you buy a house, they don't say, hey, Michael, here's $300K to buy your house. They say you sign this promissory note for $300K, and they make a journal entry that creates a new $300,000 that you now owe back plus interest.
Fractional reserve.
That's basic fractional reserve. So the banks have all this money. Now, it was also supposed to be the case that if we pumped money into the banks with the bailouts and later quantitative easing, that they would open the floodgates and start loaning money to businesses.
Right.
They would start loaning money to you and I to buy houses and reinflate the housing market, and that they would do good things with this money and put it into circulation.
That
and
never
then you
materialized.
Look at inflation's held in check. All this money's been pushed in there. What do you think they're doing with this money? They're flipping right back around, and the banks are holding it in reserve for the day of reckoning, and they're giving it right back to the federal government by taking basically U.S. treasuries into their holdings and saying we're shoring up, and then we're auditing them and stress testing them to see would they handle it. And when they say, well, we have this portion sitting here in U.S. treasuries, we go, well, that's the same as cash. That's you're good. Did a good job, Chase. You did a good job, Wells Fargo. That's great. You passed the stress test. So right now, the banks have been pumping their money into U.S. treasuries. They've also turned around and played another nasty trick on Americans. A lot of these big banks have actually bought up with this money their own stock, and then they've dissolved it and reduced the total outstanding share count. So even though the dividend is the same, now it looks bigger because it's a greater portion per share.
Right.
So all of that it kind of shows you what the banks are doing. So then you say, well, how does this work out? Well, if you're going to edge off quantitative easing and you're going to stop this loop of money on this side, you got to get it back from somewhere else. Because right now what the banks are basically doing is taking money in the form of quantitative easing, and they're also taking money in the form of zero interest, pretty much loans. And they're just making this little spread of, 2% on the treasuries.
Mm-hmm.
So they're making this little tiny return, but they're not doing anything for the money. And, the Fed has just been doling it out. But again, it's been a very incestuous loop. And that incestuous loop, if you ease the easing, as horrible as it is to say that, basically then creates a pinch point and says, okay, well, if that money's not going to circulate that way anymore, we've got to draw it out from somewhere else. So you draw it out in the form of all these new ways to get Americans to save more money for their retirement.
But at some point, I mean, look, we can't continue to shuffle we're going to run out of walnut shells and we're going to run out of playing cards to continue to build the house, right?
Well, sort of, but they've set a trap that benefits them greatly and may or may not hurt the American people directly. We'll have to see how it plays out. But remember in 2008 and into 2009, as people panicked left and right and liquidated their accounts and went to cash. When this happens again, this cycle now has been repeated enough. The American people will recognize it way faster than they have before, and they will bail. And understand, when you invest in a mutual fund, and they tell you like this fund manager is great, and they examine the companies, it's all BS, because if he's in a mid-cap stock fund, he can't move your money to cash. He has to stay in mid-cap stocks.
Right.
So when Americans bail out this time, at least the money that's held captive in the 401ks, and they start liquidating mid-cap, large-cap, dividend funds, and the stock market's taking a bath, where do you think the money's going to go now? It's going to go into U.S. debt. So at a very time when you see the market eroding and all the consumer level investors bailing out, they're going to be bailing into the dollar in the form of treasuries. And it'll prop up, at least that's the plan, it'll prop up and make us say, well, at least look, there's confidence in America's ability to resolve this problem.
Right.
Because you're getting into the point where they really understand something that very few people do, that money is a psychological contract. And what they want to make sure is that we don't break the psychological contract.
Right. We have to look like the country is strong. The only problem with that theory is that there's the law of unintended consequences. And if you ever want to see God giggle, all you have to do is tell him your best laid plans.
Yeah, I'm not saying this is going to work. I'm saying this is what the preponderance of evidence states suggests that these guys are betting on. And they're going to make a ton of money on this. They will collectively exit positions. I mean, they do that all the time anyway, but as they get closer to this where they know it's going to happen, they'll collectively exit short backsides. I mean, you're going to see basically legal insider trading at a level you've never seen before during the next major market correction. And don't ask me when it's going to be, because I don't know right now. A lot of people are saying this year. My gut is not this year. And it could be a couple of years yet before. When I say major, I don't mean 1,000 points. I mean, when you're looking back at 2009 and going, boy, that wasn't that bad. That's what I'm talking about.
I got you. All right, so you're suggesting that this, instead of a complete and utter collapse, would be more of like an elongated slide almost, correct?
Yeah, a shift. Yeah, I call it an economic shift versus a collapse. I think that at least that's the plan again. What they want to do is they want to control the descent. And what they're actually doing is robbing the American people blind. And this goes into when we start looking at what we call, the middle class and falling from the middle class. And there's been a lot of news about that in the last few years. But the way the media presents it is, well, John was a member of a middle class family. His father worked at an auto place and his mother did this, and they had a good living. And he went to college and did everything he was supposed to do, but now he's working as a waiter and he's not in the middle class, even though his dad's still there. His dad's retired and his dad wants, and just that kind of story that There's no reason that this person, instead of having people going up into the middle class, we're having the Americans now fall out. And that's true, but it's not the real story. Once again, the real story is always more insidious. And what has actually happened is the value of being in the middle class has been eroded. So people today that live solidly in the middle class to upper middle class do not have the quality of life that somebody with that same label had 25 years ago.
Agreed.
Not because they've fallen out, but because the class system itself has been eroded, backslid down the backside. What does it mean
It's become
to be there?
thinner as a class.
Correct. So there is a point at which they're basically going to say to the American people, you've had it really good for too long. And it's time for you to basically live like everyone else. And if you tell Americans that overnight, then, you'll end up with riots in the streets because we don't give our stuff up. People talk about riots in other countries, but when it comes to violence, when Americans feel like we've been done wrong, we're really good at it. But if you slowly take it away and make it the new normal,
right,
then eventually you end up with an entire generation of Americans that actually believe this is what the middle class lifestyle is.
I got you.
This is what it's supposed to be
This
like.
is as good as it gets.
So that if you can do that and you can get people to accept higher taxes, lower wages, greater inflation as normal, then you have a chance to kind of, again, a soft reset button instead of a hard reset button on this debt thing. And you might even sell people on the fact that, it would just make sense if we just change the money altogether. And however they do that is yet to be determined. I actually think there's a real chance of going back to the gold standard. I don't think it will be the honest money that most people that love gold think it will be. I think I can do just as much damage with fractional reserve and gold as I can do with fractional reserve and without gold.
Right.
Because I'm creating money. It doesn't matter if the root of the money is debt or the root of the money is gold. If I can create 9 times what I have, we got plenty of gold to do that with.
Right.
The U.S., unless you believe the conspiracy theorists, and I don't, has more gold than any other nation in the world. So I think that there's going to be a belief that if we do that, it will shore up confidence. But then you might see $10,000 gold.
Well,
now
you got
please,
Russia.
If you're listening to Michael's show, that does not mean that Jack Spirko just told you to go out and invest your money in gold so you can become a millionaire. Because what will be the value of that $10,000?
Right. It's all relative.
Yeah.
It's all relative. Well, now.
Yeah, so I think somehow we've got to hit that reset button at some point because the number is going to get away from us. We are rapidly headed to a point where the interest on the debt will be the single largest expense on our balance sheet.
Right.
Larger than the Department of Defense.
Larger than entitlements.
Larger than the Social Security bill.
Right.
And that's, at that point, we've hit the end. So before that happens, something has to shift. And it's not going to be because we tax the rich. It's not going to be because everybody pays a little bit more. It's not going to be any of the nonsense you hear out of politicians. It's going to have to be a fundamental shift in the economic system itself.
When you hear about foreign nations, and I'm thinking specifically about Russia and China, who have been buying gold by the metric ton now, and they're buying it in tonnage, how do you see that playing into this scenario?
Well, I think that they see the writing on the wall, and they're happy to give us their fake money for our fake money and use our fake money to buy gold. That's one thing. And then if we do that, then they'll say, well, we have plenty of gold. We're flush with it. The big story with China isn't gold, though. It's China's new imperialism in Africa and Central America. They pretty much own the Panama Canal at this point. They're widening it to put ships through it that are going to be massive because they want to import U.S. gas because we're glut with gas right now.
Right.
Which is another thing that's kind of staved off the end game is the energy boom. They're all over Africa. They're putting in some really shoddy infrastructure in some places and some really good infrastructure in other places. It looks very much like they're trying to figure out how much is good enough. They're buying a lot of goodwill throughout the African continent. They've shorn up an excellent relationship with South Africa, making the BRIC nations the BRICS nations now because South Africa wants to be the banker because they don't have the resources. So China's setting up to have commodity wealth, trade wealth, and real substantive wealth in the form of precious metals. They've also did something that got no media attention not too many years ago. I think it was about 7 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, China legalized the ownership of silver by citizens. If you were a Chinese citizen in 1985, you could not own silver.
Right.
It was maybe in jewelry or whatever, but you couldn't bank in it.
Sure.
Now, Chinese citizens are actually encouraged by their government to set up bank accounts that actually hold some of their wealth in silver. So the nation's holding the gold. It's encouraging its citizenry to put some of their money into silver. They're playing a very concise chess game here.
and then put it on deposit with the bank, who is, for all intents and purposes in China, the
state.
government.
Yeah, right. Well, the difference between their state bank and our state bank is we have the illusion that it's private.
Right. I get it.
I mean, that's well, everybody says, the Federal Reserve is a private institution, which is true technically, but the bigger story is that all the banks are actually government run.
Sure.
When you look at the way things go, because where does the money come from? Where do the banks get their money? And the place the banks get their money ultimately is the Fed. And then the Fed is appointed by the government, and the government sets the policies that let this happen. And the Treasury, is the one that issues the bonds.
Right.
So in the end, you've got basically I know some of your listeners won't like this word because it'll conjure up the wrong concept of what I'm talking about, but it's fascism. It's the state and private entities working in consort together and leveraging the classes as an intermediary and seeing those different class stratification levels as advantageous to the state and to the corporatocracy if they're properly legislated and mediated, which means turning us against ourselves.
Right.
And I mean, and that's where we are. And people don't like that word because they think, well, Hitler and killing millions and millions of people. And that's not fascism. That's something one fascist state did.
Right.
Italy was a fascist state. There weren't 6 million Jews in concentration camps in Italy.
Sure.
It didn't change fascism. But what we have is what I call the new neo-fascism. So old fascism,
it's economic.
The state told the corporation what to do. Well, we just flip that over, and the corporation tells the state what to do now.
Exactly. It's funny because I own the domain corporatocracy, and
do something with it, man, because people need to learn that word.
I have been long pushing the concept that, and if you use the word corporatocracy, people kind of understand that. But if you use the word fascism, which is synonymous, they don't, or they take it the wrong way. And in reality, fascism is public and private enterprise together, working towards an agenda or a goal, and that
Freddie Mac.
And right, Freddie Mac, exactly, Fannie Mae, all of them, sure.
Yeah.
So all right, let's just talk a little bit about solutions, because I think most people who are listening to this now, if this is the first time they've heard this concept, they have got a lot to think about. I have been concerned about the issue of a global collapse in terms of a fiscal or economic one, because of the fact that we're seeing the petrodollar is endangered at this point. You've got the BRICS countries out there putting an enormous amount of pressure on the dollar as the reserve currency. You're saying that this is going to be, instead of the plane auguring in nose first, that it's going to come in for a belly whop.
Yeah.
However, it's still going to hit hard. And so here's the question. What do they do, and how do they prepare themselves for this? What can you do to minimize the impact of this shift, the economic shift, as you're calling it?
Well, I mean, what you have to do is you have to start thinking differently. You really, and I mean, this is what I've dedicated my life to. I came on to talk to you about this subject because I thought it'd be very interesting to your listeners and lead them into a new line of thought of it, instead of just coming on talking about preparedness, which is the main thing that I talk about, 5 days a week on my show, The Survival Podcast.
Right.
But what you have to start doing is changing your mindset and changing what you consider wealth. So, for instance, when I started this walk, I, like most Americans, had lots of debt. And one of the first steps you need to do is get out from under your debt. The only debt that I see any value in right now is a mortgage, because they're so stupid cheap still. And what I will say, though, is if your plan is to pay it off at the minimum payment in 30 years, you're not getting it. It's something that you use and you wind it down as quickly as you can. It's amazing how fast you can own your home for real if you don't have a lot of other debt going on.
Right.
So the debt elimination or just really minimalization is the first step, because this whole thing that the dollar will be worthless, there'll always be some form of money. Whatever happens, they'll replace it with another form of money. And what I've learned from many interviews with people out of Argentina that dealt with this type of thing is, when you have inflation, the money does not become something you want less of. You need more of it.
Right.
So you're going to need more money. So we have to stop disposing of money. The other thing we have to do is start to realize that, coming at this from a survival standpoint now, there are, 6 main needs that you have: food, water, shelter, energy, security, and then I put in one thing, because people understand it this way, health and sanitation. And most Americans buy all of those a la carte, as needed, every day throughout their life. You pay your electric bill monthly. You buy your food weekly. And we don't think like companies and corporations. Corporations don't do this. One of the most financially successful companies in the world is Southwestern Airlines, in a tough competitive industry. One of their secrets is when they wait for fuel to go down and they buy a huge contract on it when it's cheap.
Right.
They buy and they amortize the cost over time. So I talk about food storage, but I'm not talking about calling up the guy you hear on the Alex Jones show and buying a tractor trailer load of MREs that are put in your garage. I find that to be foolish. But eating what you store and storing what you eat, and beginning to build up a food reserve. It's amazing that when you can feed yourself, then you're not afraid, and then you don't make stupid decisions and do knee-jerk reactions in panic situations. Because the plan is for when people to panic, them to run to a certain place, and that will always be the trap, right? My dad used to say, never make it really easy for the fox to get to the bait when you set a trap, because if you do, he knows it's a trap. You got to make it hard for him.
Gotcha.
So think that way, and to start building up reserves of food, water, energy, start being able to provide for your own security. And I don't mean put a burglar alarm in. I mean, learn how to use a firearm. Teach your family how to do that. Practice your God-given right to self-defense and to keep and bear arms that the Constitution doesn't give you but protects. Get training on that. Start to understand that energy is not just about throwing a bunch of solar panels on your roof. The first thing you want to do is shore up the efficiency of what you have. And then, yes, start looking at alternative energy means. Start producing some of your own food. Start working with local producers of food to eat better quality food, and have those contacts now so that if food shortages happen, and they will, that you have the relationships with the local producers that are still able to produce during these down times, because they're going to sell to you first. Produce as much as you can for yourself. Start to look at yourself, no matter whether you own a business or not, like you own a business. Start seeing your job like you are an independent contractor, and that your paycheck isn't a paycheck, it's payment on an invoice. That mental change will start sending you toward the ways that you can make more money. I don't care how bad I think the economy is going to be. My biggest advice would be, if there's any way you can do it, start a business of your own. Build a business and build wealth. Change your definition of wealth. Start to understand that a set of tools that last you your entire life that you know how to use is an asset. The car that declines in value is not an asset, it's a liability. But tools and knowledge are assets. Protect some of your money by putting some of it into precious metals. I advocate just 5 to 10%. And I think if you go more than that, you're in an exposure level I'm not comfortable with. But if you went up to 20, I'd be like, I wouldn't do it, but I understand. If you went above that, I'd be like, you need to really pull that back in and correct it. And I think the biggest thing is to change your diet of information. I think there's good sources of information out there. I think, Michael, I think your show is one example of some really great information that's even now reaching kind of the mainstream Americans. But the majority of what you hear on the news is programmed specifically to get a specific reaction out of you. And the number one reaction they're looking for is apathy. And the problem is that they're creating what I would call a false apathy. You actually care, but you feel disempowered.
Right.
I think the greatest weapon the American people right now have against our government is true apathy. A belief that most of what you do is no longer necessary, that we could do just fine without you, and to focus on building resiliency, self-sufficiency, and self-reliance in our own lives. And the only way we're going to get enough Americans to turn away from government solutions is to start there. Here's what you can do. Here's how you build self-sufficiency. Here's how you build self-reliance. Because until the American people learn this fact, we're never going to get out of this mess. And that is, if you turn to politicians for your solutions, you will always end up kneeling before them. Right. If you want to stand, you cannot go to Washington.
One of the problems that I have with that whole mentality is, it's the old adage of you're asking the slave master to will he please stop the beatings, right? And it's like, no, the slave who intends to be free stands up and demands that the beatings stop and is willing to fight to end them if necessary. And Correct. People just don't want to get that, And the people that caused the problem should have no say in the solution. I wish they would fix it, but clearly, think of your Uncle Sam as a drunken, degenerate drug addict that lives in your house, okay? Right. And he got a hold of your checkbook, and he's wrecked your credit.
He's damaged your home. He's got vagrants living in the back bedroom. There's holes in the walls. You're out of money. And he turns to you and says, look, I'm sorry I messed up, but since I messed it up, I should fix it. So I'll tell you what, just put some more money in the bank account, give me the checkbook, and I'll get it all taken care of.
Right. This time I know exactly what I'm doing.
Bums rush out the door, right? Right? But the American people turn to their Uncle Vagrant Sam and say, yeah, here's some more money, fix the problem for us. And we actually are dumb enough to believe if we just get different mafia heads of the family in control, that things will work themselves out.
Yeah. Utterly ridiculous. And in the meantime, by the way, they're actively out there trying to rob you of your ability to defend yourself and your family. When you look at what's going on up in Connecticut right now, I mean, that's a travesty. And
yeah, there was a police lieutenant. I just saw a video of yesterday. A lady got a letter that basically said her husband had a registered assault weapon. And that since he didn't meet the registration deadline, he had certain options. So she called this police lieutenant and asked him, well, if he doesn't do one of these things, are you going to come to our door and take him away with force? And he's, tap danced around the issue. And to be fair to him, he really can't answer that. He doesn't know what he's going to do.
Right.
But eventually in her grilling, he said, you sound un-American.
I heard that. I mean,
and
stunning.
That was really me questioning the constitutionality of a law makes me un-American.
Right.
And that pervasive belief by our government tells you that what I just told you is true. If you go to them for solutions, you better get down on your knee like you're in front of a king. You're going to kneel when you go to them because that's how they view you. And this cop is probably not a bad guy. Our law enforcement have been trained for so long to think this way. And what actually encourages me are things like Oath Keepers, where there's guys saying, well, you can train us that way all you want, but you know what? In the end, we're not going to be doing that. But the majority, especially in large departments, municipal departments, large major cities, these guys are just doing what they were trained. And they're, when they come in as a young officer, they go through academy, they believe that what they're doing is right. And that's why I'd say, if you have listeners that are in law enforcement and you're that older officer, it's a little more seasoned and you know what's going on, you take those rookies under your wings, because I think in the end, what we really need to see is the true system of checks and balances kicking in America. And there's the checks and balances you never learn about in school. One is law enforcement. If law enforcement won't enforce a law, it has no teeth. And the other is the jury. The jury's the final check. And if a jury says not guilty, a judge can't order the jury to say guilty.
Right.
And those two checks only can be used through education. You have to inform people of their rights in law enforcement and inform people of their rights as a jury. And you say, well, that's selective law enforcement. Sure it is. And every single time
that's what they're doing now anyway.
And you drive by, right, and you're 10 over and he goes, it's not so bad today. And he lets you go. That's selective enforcement too, isn't it?
Sure. So is determining who is not going and who is not going to be deported based on whether or not, right? I mean, that, the whole idea is
that
selective
homeschool
enforcement.
family, right? With the back to Germany where they face imprisonment for homeschooling their kids. And we got to do something about illegal immigration. And I'm not saying we should, but if you're serious about that, I can show you all the illegal immigrants you want to round up. Right. I mean, come on down here to Texas and we'll go to Lowe's and we'll go to the racetrack parking lot and we'll go to Home Depot parking lot. And we can fill up every ICE truck you have. But no, we can't do that. That would be wrong. That would be destroying families. We want to take the whole family together and
put
send
them all
back
in jail
to Her Highness Merkel,
right,
so that they can put them in prison for having the audacity to take responsibility for educating their children.
Isn't that amazing? When I look at this problem with law enforcement, and I've said this before on my own program, I look at these police and I say, a lot of you guys who are believers in the Constitution and your oath and your sworn oath and duty, we look at you and we say the same thing that you say about the Muslim terrorists. If you're a Muslim and you are in a mosque where you've got a small group of individuals that are radicalized, then we're looking at you and saying, if you don't remove them out of there, that's why you've given the whole religion a bad name. And it's the same thing with police. If you know who's bad and dirty in your department, it's up to you to step up and make sure they're kicked out of there and that they're away from and that you're protecting us, the citizenry, from those people. And if you don't do that, then no wonder that police departments are getting a bad name across the board.
Yeah. And I call that out on my show all the time. And what I tell officers is actually far more harsh than what you're saying. What I actually say is if you're doing these things, then you're an oath breaker. I encourage you to be an oath keeper, but if you're doing these things, you're an oath breaker. And I also say, though, that even if you wouldn't do them, if you stand by silently and idly while you let your brother officers do them, you're also breaking your oath. Because if I stood by and watched you murder someone, Michael, and I didn't do anything at all to prevent it, when they come arrest you, they're coming for me too.
Right.
And the whole point of law enforcement and military service, by the way, in this nation, is that it is all citizens serving, not conscripts.
Right.
And that is about equality. And there is no way that any law should apply to me that does not equally apply to a member of our United States Armed Services or a uniformed officer of the peace. Now, they may have additional standards and additional laws and additional requirements that you and I do not, but none of what we are required to do should ever be removed from their level of responsibility.
In fact,
and if a cop stands by and lets another cop beat a suspect to death in handcuffs, the guy that stood there and watched it is as much responsible as the guy that kicked his head in.
Agreed. And worse yet, but they actually have a higher standard. I mean, they're the ones who have sworn an oath and taken the job willingly to uphold the law and to serve and protect, which you'll never see on any of their cars anymore. Now it just says law enforcement, right?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
when you look at it from that perspective and you say to yourself, if you're going to be in the law enforcement business and you guys are not going to police your own house, then don't dare come telling me how to police mine.
Well, the problem there again, though, is when we say police their house, you're asking government to police government. And that's because the citizenry has fallen down on its job to police government. We're the ones that are supposed to be the guardians of the republic, not them. The role of government in our society, in this republic, is supposed to only be for them to defend the individual who's not capable of defending themselves. So the person that's a victim of an actual crime, the purpose of government is to bring justice for that victim and to prevent further victimization of that victim. It is not for them to guard the republic. That's our responsibility. The greatest failure of leadership in the United States today is not the presidency. It's not the Congress. It's the United States people who have gone asleep at the switch and let those people do what they're doing up there, that let the banks control their nation, that let the government control the nation. The government is supposed to run the nation, not control it. We're supposed to be running the ship. And if you go to sleep, hey, whatever nefarious character is strongest becomes the captain.
Absolutely. And in the direction they take the ship, you have no control.
Well, they're probably taking it a place where you can get off and work when you get there. And,
right.
We have modern day slavery today. Basically, what we have is a slavery where the slave feeds himself, clothes himself, houses himself, builds his own cell. Not only does he do that, he actually administers his own work release program, forges his own chains, and then polishes the shackles and is proud of them. That's modern American life today. And most people cannot comprehend what you mean when you say something like that. But if you look at the totality of life in America today, if you look at how long you work for the state on an annualized basis, if you look at how much they take from you directly and indirectly, if you add inflation to that, the devaluation of your wealth, the taxing of everything you do productive and your property, and then you say you're not a slave, I ask you, what is a slave then?
Right. It's almost funny. It's almost like we're looked at as the first functional perpetual motion machine. We actually produce enough and in excess of what we generate or need for our own generation. And they're living on the excess energy that we're producing, right?
Yeah, it is. And the problem with that is, though, that so many people have now caught on to, well, it's not necessary for me to be the one in the wheel.
Right.
And gone off on the dole, as they call it. There's less and less of us in society actually producing. And when you ask what really brings all of this to a head, it's when there's not enough producers doing the work anymore.
Right.
And all of the consumers get to the point where they're taking more than we can produce. So a lot of the producers then just say, well, I'm done.
Right.
I'm not going to go across the bridge to the other side and become a leech on society, but I'm done producing. I quit.
And I think we're pretty close
it's like
to
a
that.
modern day John Galt. And I think people think that's a good thing, and it can eventually be a good thing. But most things that create radical positive shifts in history create an awful lot of misery in the interim. And that's why I teach preparedness, because you got to be able to get through that gap.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what. This not only have you opened and enlightened us about this pension fund issue, which and retirement fund issue, which is, I mean, to be honest with you, I was not aware of this at all, and so I'm grateful to you for bringing it to the attention of our listeners and to my attention. And it's something I'll definitely do some more homework on. But you know, it goes beyond that, because you've got a vision of where this is going, and you have a good insight on what we can do to try to prepare ourselves to be better suited, not only psychologically and financially, but you know, in our spirit for where we're headed here. And I don't foresee a lot of great things for Americans. I see a lot of time that is going to be fraught with some very, very serious trouble in our future, and for quite an extended window of time. This is not something that, when it happens, it's going to resolve itself in 12 or 18 or 24 months. This is going to be decades.
Yeah, it may be a multi-decade long solution, but I think that if you're prepared for it, it actually can be a time of great prosperity. There were people that became millionaires during the Great Depression. And, you know, I'm not saying that's going to happen for everybody out there that's prepared, but I am saying that you'll be much better off if you're prepared than if you're not. And we're going to get into a state again where people are going to need to know how to do things for themselves. And, you know, that's why I do what I do. Occasionally I do a show where I talk the way that I'm talking today, but most of the shows I do every day on my podcast are designed to teach skills, everything from how to grow your own food to how to manage livestock to how to fix things to how to start a business. We bring guests on to talk about alternative energy. If it has anything to do with preparedness, self-sufficiency, and self-reliance, and independence and liberty, we cover it. So it'd be great if some of your folks could get by my site. It is at TheSurvivalPodcast.com, or in different parts of the country, people would say TheSurvivalPodcast.com. But the or the is important, that it go at the beginning of that. And come on by, and we have over 1,300 episodes. I've been doing the show since 2008. I started it in 2008 in my car. I built it into a six-figure business in 2 years. Today, it provides all of our livelihood for my family, and we have about 90,000 people a day that listen to what we're doing now and participate in various different communities within our community. We have an amazing Zello channel. That's kind of like CB radios, but we have our own channel that you can use on your smartphone with people, you know, asking each other questions, getting answers, running through what if scenarios about, you know, possible disasters and how that they would handle them. We have a forum with over 10,000 members that support each other. It's an amazing blessing that's come into my life. And I think it's because you know, there's an old saying, if you tell a lie loud enough and long enough, people will believe it. But I think if you tell the truth long enough and loud enough, people listen to it.
Agreed. And I know you've got an enormous following, and you have a very, very active group that you know participate with you. And I do encourage our listeners to get out there to the Survival Podcast. So thanks very much, Jack. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm grateful that you came on with us today.
Well, Michael, thanks for having me. And if you ever want to come back on my end, the door is always open to you. And if you ever have something you want to discuss here, let me know, and we'll do this again.
Heck yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
God bless.